My life changed the day I put a gun to my head. The years without my wife and son were unbearable. Time and hope seemed to pass by in tandem. With no family or friends, I grabbed two of my favorite possessions, a bottle of bourbon and my .45 caliber revolver. It was cold, rainy, and quiet. A good day to die. I took a final swig and placed the cold barrel against my sweating temple. With one final deep breath, I wrapped my finger around the trigger and... knock, knock, knock. I set the gun down, racking my brain as to who could be at the door. I never had visitors. Still, I feared this person could hear the gunshot, and I didn't want anyone to be involved with my death. I had already caused enough trauma for a lifetime. I got up from my bed and slowly stumbled to the front door. To my surprise, there was no one there. Instead, a bouquet of 13 black roses and a small brown parcel sat on my doorstep. As I looked up on the inked-coloured flowers, images of my wife's funeral played in my drunken mind. The memory of a memorial service is hazy, but there are a few details that I will never forget. The cold rain dampening my grey suit, the glaring stares of judgment from her family, the familiar sting of bourbon in the back of my throat, and the bouquet of black roses placed next to her casket. It was the first time I had ever seen black roses, and they stood out like a drop of dark paint on a white canvas. I looked down at the package again. A card placed within the black flowers asked one simple question in red ink. Why do we dig graves? To this day, I have no idea who left the ominous flowers and strange note. Life as a single parent was difficult. My wife was the one who held our small family together, and then it was just my son and I for a while. I would give anything to have my boy back. I should have been keeping an eye on him the day he went missing. As usual, I was too busy slipping out of consciousness, fumbling to take another drink before my heavy eyelids shut. The police never found him, and they probably never will. He was 7 years old when he was abducted. I bent down and grabbed the items from my doorstep, brought them inside, and placed them on the table. After a few moments, I tore open the rain-soaked parcel. Inside was a single spool of Super 8 film. Whoever sent me the package knew me well. Collecting Super 8 was my only hobby, although I rarely spoke of it. With the film in one hand and my bourbon in the other, I retreated to the basement and proceeded to dust off my old projector, hung a small sheet over a clothesline, and loaded the film. The image burst to life. A buzzing swarm of grey static was followed by a theatrical countdown. 3, 2, 1. The black and white picture was shaky, displaying rapid flashes of clouds and sky. I inched closer to get a better view of the video. The scene came into focus. A boy in a large field covered in dirt and grime. The camera zoomed closer, and his face came into the frame. The bottle fell from my hand and shattered on the floor. The boy was my son, Benjamin, and he was digging a large hole. I gasped. I was sure it was him. Thoughts raced through my head. I felt dizzy. Where was he? What was he doing? Who sent the film? I kept watching, and in an instant, the basement exploded with sound, forcing me back in a fright. A deep, grainy voice spoke. Benjamin. My son stopped digging, cocked his head to the side, and stared at the camera. Benjamin, why do we dig graves? To bury the dead, my son said in a monotone voice. And why do we bury the dead? The deep voice asked. Benjamin responded. We bury the dead to feed the black roses. I jumped to my feet and paced around the basement. I had to act. I had to rescue him. The voice spoke again. Do not tell anyone. Come alone. The camera panned to a large hole Benjamin had been digging, then focused on the surrounding area. It hit me. I knew the building he was standing near. It was the abandoned warehouse I used to pass on the way to work. It's a monstrous eyesore in the middle of nowhere and has been falling into disrepair for half a century. I knew where to go. I knew where my son was. I ran upstairs, nearly tripping on every step. My mind continued to race as my nausea reached its peak. I sprinted to the bathroom and expelled the alcohol I had for breakfast. The factory. I had to go. I had to get back my son. I dressed as quickly as I could, grabbing my coat, forcing on my boots, and tucking the pistol in my waistband. I started my truck and hit the road. The drive was eerily quiet, as if the earth had stopped turning. Dark overcast flooded the world around me in a dreary atmosphere, void of light and warmth. 20 minutes into my drive, I realized I had not seen another person, or even another vehicle. I was alone. This solitude continued throughout my entire trip. Eventually, the factory came into view. Its dark red brick cut through the horizon. I parked my truck and marched through the vast field of dirt towards the building, carefully avoiding the sporadic, rectangular graves scattered across the grounds. Upon crossing the large, broken, iron-gated threshold, I crept towards the entrance of the abandoned factory, my footsteps making the only noise in an otherwise silent world. The massive front door creaked open. I inhaled deeply and stepped inside. It was enormous. Concrete walls and steel beams towered above me for miles. The floor was an endless sea of broken brick, metal, and dust. The skeleton of an old assembly line sat motionless in the center of the main room. I clicked on my flashlight and began my search, unsure of where to start. I walked the halls for what seemed like hours, frantically opening doors, only to find more dust and darkness. I was ready to give up. I decided I would head home, turn the film reel into the police, and drink this all away. I walked back to where I had entered the facility. When I finally reached it, I stood in disbelief. The door was gone. It had been replaced by a solid concrete wall. I pushed against it with all my strength. How was this possible? An explosion of noise and flashing light filled the entire factory. I spun around and drew the revolver from my waistband. The assembly line sprung to life with a loud grinding of gears. I walked forward to investigate. Piles of twisted metal and glass traveled down the line and into the next room. An aroma filled the air, smelling of oil and gasoline. I studied the contents, quickly discovering that they were automotive parts, horribly dented and broken. After a few moments, the factory lights went out with a flash, and the assembly halted. I walked into the next room to see where the belt ended. I pushed open the double doors and walked inside. I pointed my flashlight towards a massive, dark object in the middle of the room. As soon as I saw what it was, I froze. It was a car. My wife's car. The memory of the night she died flooded my mind. I was drinking, always drinking. The sound of wind and snow whistled loudly outside. Benjamin was upstairs in his room, bedridden from a flu that had been going around his school. My wife had just gotten home from work, disgusted at the state I had drunken myself into. She sighed as she looked me up and down. "Well, since you clearly can't drive, I guess I'll go get some medicine for our son." She slammed the door as she left. That's the last thing I remember from that evening. The next morning, I was filling out paperwork at the police station. She died in the hospital a few hours after the crash. I was at home, unconscious during her final moments of life. I didn't deserve her, and I never got the chance to say goodbye. I slowly approached the mangled remains of the sedan, shining my light through the broken windows. I crept towards the driver's side window and peered inside. As my light illuminated inside of the vehicle, I fell back in horror. My eyes had to be lying. It wasn't possible. A human body sat in the seat. His forehead rested against the steering wheel. I fumbled backwards until my back met a cold, concrete wall. I slowly slumped down and buried my face into my hands. The dizziness and confusion returned. My thoughts began to race as I questioned the reality of the situation, overwhelmed with a familiar feeling of guilt. The guilt that I have felt every day since her accident. The guilt I try and drink away each day. I sat in the darkness, unsure of what to do or what to think. The room was spinning again, and the darkness washed over me as I turned off my light. I couldn't stand to look at her car any longer. The silence of the room was broken by an unmistakable noise, a noise which I refused to believe was real. The opening of a car door. The hinges screeched loudly and echoed throughout the vacant factory floor. However, it was the sound that followed which left me paralyzed with fear. Wet, crackling footsteps on the stone floor approached me. I fumbled to pick up my flashlight. The room illuminated, and I gasped. "No, it can't," was all that I was able to stutter. It was her, or what was left of her. The tattered remains of my wife's corpse stood before me, staring down at me with one eye, the other an empty socket dripping with blood. She was wearing the same clothes as the night of the wreck, torn and stained. I tried to speak again. "Helen, I'm so sorry." Warm tears ran down my face, and the flashlight shook violently in my quivering hand. The body shuffled forward, dragging a crushed foot and leaving behind a trail of dark blood. It knelt in front of me and placed a cold, skeletal hand against my cheek. The smell of rot was overwhelming. I closed my eyes tightly as I dry heaved from the putrid stench. I could feel its face a few inches from my own, my tears now an uncontrollable river. It pushed its cold, decaying face against mine and whispered broken words into my ear. "Why do we Dig the graves. I screamed at the top of my lungs as I fired the 45. The sound was deafening. It reverberated through the cavernous building. Seconds later, a deep silence overtook the building. I slowly opened my eyes. It was gone. All of it. The car, the corpse, everything. The heart was beating out of my chest as I tried to catch my breath. The smell of gasoline and rotten flesh still lingered in the air. Just as I began to calm myself, the factory lights flickered on, and the conveyor belt sprung to life once again. I whipped my light rapidly around the room. Feelings of confusion and anger pulsed through my body. I looked towards the conveyor belt as new objects began to appear. I crept forward to get a better look. They were toys. Benjamin's toys. I recognized them immediately. The bear I bought him for his second birthday, his first bicycle, toy trucks, games and action figures. They rode along the conveyor belt, evenly spaced a couple feet apart. The toy in the belt fed into the next room. My fear and confusion had subsided and were replaced with a burning rage. Who was doing this? Who was torturing me? My questions were answered as I kicked open the door of the next room. Standing in the middle of the floor was my son. It had been years since I had seen him. Behind him stood a figure much taller than me and dressed in a dark, hooded cloak. Its face was completely shadowed. Two frail hands were outstretched and resting on Benjamin's shoulders. "Let him go, now!" I spat as I pulled back the hammer of the revolver. They both remained still and unwavering. "Now!" I screamed as I fired a round into the ceiling. "Father," Benjamin said. "Ben, please come with me. We have to get you home," I cried. He spoke again. "Each day, Father, with every drink, we dig the grave a little deeper." And before my eyes, his body withered away. In its wake, hundreds of black rose petals slowly fell to the ground, forming a large pile on the floor. The hooded figure remained. "What did you do? Bring him back!" I cried. The figure slowly pulled back his hood, and I looked in disbelief. A disfigured version of myself stood before me. His contorted face grinned as he raised a bottle of amber liquid to its mouth and took a drink. A horrible, inhuman laugh escaped its mouth and filled the room. Without hesitation, I fired a bullet straight into the monstrosity's head, and my world fell into silence. Bright lights and machine noises flooded my senses. I whipped my head around and frantically scanned the unfamiliar room. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. Even then, leather straps fastened my hand to a cold, steel bed. I was trapped. A doctor in a white coat walked in and sat next to my bedside. He smiled as he explained how lucky I was. Lucky that a neighbour walking their dog happened to hear the gunshot and called an ambulance. Lucky that I had just awoke from a month-long coma, and lucky that someone cared enough to send me flowers. I looked at the bedside table and gazed at a vase full of jet black roses. And for the first time in a decade, I didn't feel like having a drink.